Well, the older I get, the more I realize that the things I've always known or had are becoming more and more essential in my life. Or it's hard for me to understand a world where those things didn't exist. And the easiest way to explain that is in the medical field. Throughout my entire life, things like x-rays and CT scans and MRIs have always been possible. So to me, it's hard to fathom how doctors ever did their job before those things. Particularly think of something like an x-ray. Now, I know I did look up some things, and I'm sorry, the kids can be dismissed. I forgot to do that. So kids, you can be dismissed. I apologize for forgetting about that. Down the hallway and rooms 3 and 5. Sorry about forgetting about that. So anyway, so x-rays. So apparently doctors could diagnose a broken bone before x-rays. And obviously if it was a compound fracture with the bone sticking out, okay, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to really diagnose that there's a broken bone there. But they could diagnose and set bones before x-rays. But to me, if I have a broken bone, I'm going to go get an x-ray. And even though the doctor doesn't necessarily need that, we have this expectation that that's what should happen. Because I remember when I was in 2nd grade, I broke my first bone. And I was getting ready to go into 2nd grade, and I was rollerblading with my cousin. I was at his house. He was in 4th grade, I was in 2nd grade. We were in his basement. It was just an unfinished basement slab, and down the middle of the basement had those adjustable columns, the small support beams. And we were just rollerblading, having fun. We decided we were going to weave in and out of those columns. And we're going, and we would grab the column to propel ourselves forward, and just had a really good time until I missed. And instead of grabbing the column, I hit it with my arm. And so I was almost in 2nd grade, and so I was in pain. I was crying. It was not a really pleasant experience for me. But we've got a 2nd grader and a 4th grader by themselves in the basement trying to diagnose the situation. And so my cousin, we're trying to figure out what's going on, what's wrong. Did I break it? Did I just hurt it? Is this really no big deal? And so he says, well, can you move your fingers? And so I remember I can just kind of like barely move them. And so we come to the conclusion that since I can move my fingers, my arm's not broken. Great. All right. So needless to say, our rollerblading was done for the day. So we go upstairs and start playing video games. And we're playing, and I realize I can move my thumb to push the button, but I can't move it quickly, and I can't put much force behind it. So I realize I can't play video games. So I kind of just hang out there. He's playing video games. Now, to be fair, we both think I'm fine. My cousin is not being negligent towards me, and remember, he's also only in 4th grade at the time. So after about 2 hours, my aunt realizes what's been going on in her house. So she calls my mom, and adults start getting into the diagnosed situation here, and they take me to the hospital. I have a broken arm. I just needed a cast a few weeks, and I was fine. And my aunt felt really bad that I was in her house for so long without her knowing that I was in pain. But again, we were thinking we were doing what we were supposed to do. But as I was thinking through that and realizing what was going on, I realized that the inside has to be right before the outside can be functional. And when we think about our spiritual lives, we have to be repaired inside before the outside can be relevant. But too many times we walk around with this fake facade of how can we look the part of Jesus, but on the inside we're a mess all over the place. And James gives us some insights in his book, James chapter 1. We're going to be picking up in verse 19. As he tells us, a common thing that most people know, James says, you should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to get angry. For human anger does not produce the righteousness of God. So get rid of all filth and evil in your lives and humbly accept the word God has planted in your hearts, which has the power to save your souls. So that's a somewhat familiar passage even to those who may not be part of the Christian faith. You know, the quick to listen and slow to speak, slow to get angry. But we also know that listening is good. In fact, listening can solve a lot of problems. If we would just take time to listen to others, whether they're complaints, whether they're ideas, whatever it is, that would solve a lot of frustration, a lot of complaining, just a lot of negative type things. But with this, we're also supposed to listen to God. And when we listen, it's a sign of humility. Not necessarily as though we're giving in to somebody else's point or argument, but in a way that we recognize that they have validity in who they are and their point of view. So we're affirming the other people when we actually listen to them. But we should also be slow to speak. That's really hard for preachers to talk about, right? Right? You're probably like, yeah, you should have been slower about 10 minutes ago, right? But the fact of the matter is, when we speak too much, it devalues other people. If listening validates them, speaking too much devalues them. Proverbs chapter 17, verse 28 says, even fools are thought wise when they keep silent. With their mouth shut, they seem intelligent. I just love that thought process. You know, people assume you're at least somewhat intelligent if you keep your mouth shut. And then I came across this quote. It's one of those quotes that's falsely attributed to like Mark Twain or Abraham Lincoln. So I'm not actually sure who said this, but the quote is, better to remain silent and be thought a fool than to speak and remove all doubt. You know, think about that. We know people who talk too much, and sometimes they talk themselves into a hole or a corner, and if they just would have been quiet earlier, it wouldn't have been as big of a deal. But sometimes talking not only devalues other people, but it gets us into trouble. I mean, you think of salesmen. One of the key principles for a salesman is know when to stop talking. Stop talking, so now it's the consumer's responsibility to fill the gap. People hate silence, by the way. Now, most people just get uncomfortable when there's silence. And for salesmen, if they're silent, that means the consumer will be the one speaking and maybe make some compromises or give some indication of where they're willing to go on the payment scale. But then we also have these clever phrases or sayings that help us remember the difference between listening and speaking. I love the one that silent and listen are spelled with the same letters. Or probably my personal favorite is you have 2 ears and 1 mouth, so you should listen twice as much as you speak. Right? Those are things we know. So the principle of listening is not just a Christian thing, it's a world thing. But when we're talking about spiritually, we have to recognize we must be repaired inside before the outside is relevant. And then we get to the anger side of things. We like to justify anger by saying, well, God gets angry, right? James very explicitly tells us that human anger does not produce the righteousness of God. But yet, we love righteous indignation, don't we? We love to get mad in a holy way for Jesus. That's how we feel, right? And there are certain areas or causes that sometimes spark that type of motivation. Next week is Freedom Sunday, and we will be emphasizing human trafficking and how we can combat that in our world. And to be honest, the one thing that probably boils my blood the most in this world is the evil of human trafficking, particularly when it involves children. I don't know how you can sleep with yourself if you are involved in those types of things, yet people are. It shows how evil our world is, but it also shows how blind the world is to evil, because there are ways people participate in evil without doing it intentionally, or actually don't think they're harming other people. But it's hard for me to love people who are involved in those types of acts. And that's where we get the problem with human anger does not produce the righteousness of God. Because when God gets angry, he still loves. Because love is who God is. God does not delight in bringing punishment or judgment or wrath or vindication. God just doesn't get happy when he has to punish people. That's not something that brings joy to him. But even when he is bringing judgment, he's still love. I would hesitate to say that when I am angry, I am loving also. But when God is angry, he is love. So that's part of what James is talking about in accepting this word that God has planted in our hearts. When we think about God planting his word, the concept of a plant implies that it's going to grow. You don't plant something hoping it doesn't grow. You want it to thrive and survive and just become more of who you are. So God's word is being planted in your hearts, not so it will be stagnant, not so that it will remain the same, but so that it will grow. But in order for it to grow, we have to have the proper ingredients. We have to cultivate it. We have to give it the nutrients. We have to give it the opportunity to grow. Things just don't grow by accident. They grow because they have the right things in place. So we have to accept and cultivate God's word that has been planted in our lives. But James continues. He doesn't stop there. He says, but don't just listen to God's word. You must do what it says. Otherwise, you are fooling yourselves. For if you listen to God's word and don't obey, it's like glancing at your face in a mirror. You see yourself, walk away, and forget what you look like. But if you look carefully into God's perfect law that sets you free, do what it says, and don't forget what you heard, then God will bless you for doing it. One of the things about following Jesus is that Jesus is contrary to the world. The world has this set of standards, ideals, or this is how you should or shouldn't live. Well, Jesus doesn't conform to the world. The world can do what it wants, but Jesus says this is a standard you need to live by, and the standards of Jesus aren't relative. But particularly in our world, with the advancement of social media, the internet, and just how information is so readily available, the number of platforms keep increasing. The number of voices keep increasing. So we're hearing all of these ideas and concepts from various places being poured into our lives. And it's hard not to listen to all this noise and get caught up in it. Whether we're talking about political differences or social differences or economic differences, they just keep getting put into our lives. But James says, without doing, hearing is worthless. Just because you're in the proximity of Jesus doesn't mean you're doing what he is saying. So we get to the concept of passivity. That it's real easy to be passive when we're talking about following Jesus. And in all intents and purposes, right now, you are a passive audience. I am speaking, you are listening. So all you are doing is sitting there listening to what I'm saying. Now, I'm not trying to be condemning or rebuke right here, but the fact of the matter is, if that's where your faith stops, then James says it's worthless. If all your faith in Jesus is just listening to who this Jesus is and it doesn't impact your life, then it's worthless. It's almost as though you're auditing Jesus. You know, think about, I remember I had classmates in college that would audit classes. I didn't have time to do this, so it just really kind of blew my mind that they would do it. And what it was is they were not getting credit for the class. They just were interested in the course material, so they would come to class, hear the information, maybe read some of the books for the class, and that was it. It didn't matter how often they did or didn't show up. It didn't matter. They didn't have to turn in any assignments or take any tests. They just were interested in the information, so they'd show up when they wanted. Now, I fear there are so many people following Jesus in the same way. Well, I'm just auditing Jesus, right? I'm just going to hear what Jesus is about, and that's really about it, and stop there. And James tells us that your faith is worthless. You are fooling yourselves. William Barclay says, what is heard in the holy place must be lived in the marketplace. I just think that's an interesting concept, but when we talk about the holy place, it just doesn't mean the church building. Whenever you gather with other believers and you talk about Jesus, whatever is discussed there needs to be lived wherever you live. When we talk about our personal time with Jesus, whether we're reading the Bible or praying or those types of things, whatever we experience there needs to be lived throughout the rest of our lives. It needs to be something that impacts us. But this is about our spiritual health, which comes back to the point that the inside must be repaired for the outside to be relevant. You've got to be healthy inside with Jesus before your actions can really matter. But it's not just about knowing things. It's not just about knowing the Bible or what's in there. It's asking the question of how does God's Word impact your life? How does what you do, how is that informed by what Jesus tells us in the Bible? Now, in 2007, I was playing a summer baseball game. It was between my sophomore and junior year of college. It was in Clinton, Illinois, a small town of about 5,000 people. And it was the last game, or last inning of the game. In this league I was playing in, if a pitcher issued a walk, or if a fielder committed an error, that player would have to put $1 in a jar. And at the end of the year, that money from the jar would fund our end of the season party. So just some context for you. That's not really important for the story, but I want you to know that. And so I remember the last inning of the game, I was moving to my left. I was playing shortstop. A ground ball hit to my left, and I was getting ready to field it. The base runner wasn't particularly fast, and it was a routine play. I was going to field the ball, throw him out easily, no big deal. Well, the ball decided that this rock was going to influence its trajectory. And so the ball hit the rock, and the ball came and hit me square on the nose. Blood everywhere. Just fantastic. I remember I tossed my glove aside, and this is why I shared that non-important detail, and I said, I am not putting $1 in the jar. So then I went to, needless to say, my game was over for the day. And I think we won, I don't remember, but I left. I went to the hospital, small town hospital on the weekend, and got an x-ray, and the doctor was like, well, it's broken. And it was one of those things, well, my nose was like way over on this side of my face, so of course it was broken. But then the doctor goes on to tell me that according to the x-ray, your nose is still aligned. Well, that's odd. So according to what the doctor said is that because of how the ball hit my nose, all the swelling was on the left side of my face. So it looked like my nose was off center, but really it was where it should be. All right, whatever. I wasn't in any pain. I didn't really have any interest in staying in the hospital any longer than I had to, so I left. Well, after about a week or so, we realized my nose wasn't getting much straighter. And so I made an appointment with an ENT, and he saw the x-rays, and then we talked about it. And he did say, you know, the ER doctor was right, so let's not question his ability there. But we do need to straighten it out a little bit. There's some things going on here. So I did have surgery to reset the nose, and some of you are probably trying to look real closely right now. So my nose is slightly off to the left. But you can really tell, it's really humorous when I get dental x-rays, because then you can really tell that my nose and my teeth are not anywhere near aligned where they should be. But as I was thinking about my nose, and you're all going to rush me after the service to come look at my nose now, right? So, James goes on to say that if you look at yourself in a mirror and you forget what you look like, that's what happens if you're just auditing Jesus. And I think too many times we can look at our face, you know, it's okay. You know, my nose is just a little off center. It's not a big deal. Or, you know, I may not be where I should be. And we just kind of move on. It's not a big deal. We don't take time to critically evaluate ourselves in the mirror. Because what the mirror does is it shows a reflection of reality. It shows who we are. It's not one of those things, it's not trying to distort reality. It's not trying to tell you something false. It's trying to show you what it is. And that's what God's Word does. And so when we look in God's Word, we need to be asking God's Word of what is this saying to me? What are the blemishes in my life? What are the things that aren't exactly where they need to be? How can I do better? Because the inside has to be repaired for the outside to be relevant. But then James adds this little nugget that I just love. He talks about the law. Too many times, I think, we come to the concept of God's law and we think, oh, all these rules we got to follow. All of these burdensome things that make it so we can't have fun or do what we really want to. But James shares this in a way that says when we actually understand the heart of God's law and what He's trying to tell us and show us, this law sets us free. This law is the best way to live. It provides the most satisfying and fulfilling life. See, through Jesus Christ, we can be saved, and it's through His grace that we are saved. And this grace saves us from the control of sin. As the Apostle Paul writes, we are no longer obligated to the sinful nature because Jesus has freed us from that. So when we talk about the perfect law through Jesus Christ frees us from sin's grip in our life. That is the victory and the freedom that James writes about. But too many people stop at, well, I asked Jesus into my heart, so now I'm just going to go live life however I want. When we do that, we miss the abundance of God's blessing that He wants to pour out on us. He wants to extend more and more grace to us, not to cover just our terrible choices, but so we live a life that's more fulfilling and satisfying and joyful and complete. Jesus completes our life. He doesn't hold us back. He frees us and gives us grace. But then James continues and finishes the chapter. He says, if you claim to be religious, but don't control your tongue, you are fooling yourselves and your religion is worthless. Pure and genuine religion means caring for widows and orphans and refusing to let the world corrupt you. This isn't always pleasant, at least to hear, but the language we use reflects our spiritual health. Now, there are times where we can say, well, it slipped. And I ask, well, why did we allow it to slip? If our spiritual health is to the point where we're not allowing filth in our lives, and as James says, get rid of all evil and filth. If filth isn't coming in, why is filth coming out? So when we talk about slipping, we got to recognize, well, that slip derived from somewhere. It derives from some evil in our lives. But this language also would include how we talk about other people. Think about your conversations about other people. When you're talking with one person about another person, think about those conversations, whether it's at work, whether it's at home, wherever it is. I would probably say we might be ashamed at how often our conversations are about negative things about other people. John Wesley had a saying. He said of those dead or absent, nothing but good. If someone's not present, only say good things about them. Think about how your conversations would change and the mentality would shift. Now, there are times we have to have honest conversations and evaluations and those types of things. I'm not trying to downplay all those types of things, but too many times our conversations are just about complaining or gossiping or belittling other people. And James says our language is important. Now, we do have this concept that we talk about, we need to be in the world, but not of the world. And while I agree with that sentiment, I think sometimes we use that phrase as an excuse to kind of do what we want. And so I wonder, instead of saying in the world, but not of the world, if we would say we are relating redemptively to the world. How would that change? How would that change? Because when the word redemption, that's not a normal word the world uses, right? So to me, that brings Jesus into the equation more explicitly. And if we explicitly bring Jesus into our understanding of how we're relating to the world, that should change how we relate to the world. Jesus is now part of the equation. But James talks about we're fooling ourselves or we're deceived, if our language doesn't honor Jesus. Well, in the New Testament, particularly, Jesus encounters religious leaders that often we talk about how they're hypocrites. And hypocrite means an actor. They're living one way, but they're preaching another way. They're saying, this is what you should do, so do what I say, don't do what I do. And so they're acting, and maybe they don't fully recognize it, but they know what they're doing. But the people James are talking about are not hypocrites, are those who are actually deceived. They think they're doing what they're supposed to, but they're not. They think they're following Jesus, but they not. They're self-deceived. They lack self-awareness in their spiritual lives. They are broken inside. They aren't healed. They haven't experienced Jesus in the life-transforming way that he wants to come into their lives, but yet they think they've experienced it. They're missing out. James speaks clearly of how our faith should be lived. And so we think, when we ask ourselves, well, am I a hypocrite? Am I deceived? James says one of the things we have to do is we have to evaluate our actions, not by what the world does, but by what Jesus did. Jesus valued those who society didn't. And you know what? Jesus still values those who society doesn't. James specifically mentions the orphans and widows. And in the ancient world, orphans and widows didn't have many options. The best option was for a family member to take them into their own home and basically provide for them as such. If that didn't work, maybe slavery. And after that, the next option was begging. And after that, really, it was starving. Those were the options that orphans and widows had in the ancient world, and Jesus said they have value. So no matter what the world places on someone, the value the world places, Jesus says we need to value them. And when we value those who society doesn't, it's a way that we can honor Jesus. But we have to frequently look in the mirror. We have to frequently go to God's Word so His Word, which is planted in our hearts, can grow. 2000, I was in 8th grade, the fall of 2000, and in my school, we 5th through 8th graders ate lunch together. And after lunch, we would go and have recess outside. And through a long series of events, some of my friends and I decided that we were going to go swing on the swing set that day. And so we were running for the swing. And as we were running there, it became clear that there weren't enough swings for every person running to the swing set. So my classmate Ben and I were running for the swing, and we realized there was only going to be one swing between the two of us. One of us was going to get the last swing. So we were jockeying for position, pushing back and forth. And I remember my middle finger got jammed in his side as I was pushing him. It was not Ben's fault. And I heard a pop. I was like, oh, ow, that didn't feel good. But I do want to say I persevered, I fought through, dug deep, and I got the swing that day. So I got the swing, and I just really, my hand didn't feel good. But, I mean, nothing was protruding. Everything looked fine. I just kind of went on with the rest of the day. And it was my left hand. I'm right-handed, so I could write fine, and everything with schoolwork was perfectly fine. Well, later that day at baseball practice, I told my coach about it. He said, hey, just sit out. That's fine. Take it easy. So a few days later, we had a game, and I was our catcher. And I said, Coach, I can't catch. So he said, all right, we'll have our other guy catch. You'll play in the infield. So I played the infield, no big deal. And so did that. Then the following Monday, I had another game. I played the infield again. And really the pain wasn't going away. So my parents decided that, hey, we need to take you to the doctor and see what's going on. Now, I do want to say, I did not have neglectful guardians growing up. I had very loving and caring parents and aunts and uncles. But we went to the doctor, found out my hand was broken right in the middle bone in my hand. And but it went to an orthopedic. It was fully aligned. Nothing was out of place. Basically, they didn't give me anything. Just said it's going to heal on its own. And the orthopedic said I could play baseball as pain allowed. So one of the issues is we had a really good team. We actually had a very successful season going to state, and I wanted to play, right? So the next game, I sat out. I didn't play, and we won 22-0. So as I said, we had a good team. But so it wasn't like I had to be present in every game. So the next few weeks, I played shortstop. I just couldn't catch. But eventually got to the point where our backup catcher just wasn't really cutting it anymore. Our pitcher, he was one of those guys in the 8th grade. He was a man among boys. He was bigger than everybody, stronger than them, faster than them. He was just, he was a wonderful athlete. And I had been catching him for years. And so I was very comfortable doing that. And so we decided to test it out. So I had this brace on my hand that had, the brace that goes on your wrist with a metal plate in there. And then I had a huge pad that I put in my catcher's mitt, and I started catching them, and I realized I can do this. It didn't feel pleasant. It wasn't perfect, but I could do it, and I could catch them perfectly fine. And so I caught the rest of the season. Now, one of the adjustments I did make is I had to change the bat I would use. I had to use a much smaller bat. And in fact, I used a bat that was much smaller than everybody else on the team just because the strength in my left hand wasn't there. But I could still hit line drives and get base hits and all those types of things. And so I proceeded the season and went through it, and everything was fine. But what was interesting, the next year, my freshman year of high school, my hand had obviously perfectly healed by then. We go on the baseball field, and I start hitting, and people are like, oh, you can hit. You can actually hit the ball far, because I couldn't with a broken hand. And I think what happens is too many times there are people who are trying to follow Jesus handicapped. Well, my hand's broken. I can play through, Jesus. I don't need your healing. I'm just going to fight through and do it on my own. I can move my hand a little bit. It's good. I'm going to go try to play a video game. I'm going to go try to do something else, Jesus. So I'm going to try to take care of this on my own. Or, my nose isn't that crooked. It's not that far off. It's not that big a deal. Or, I can make some adjustments. I can put some padding in my glove. I can use a different bat. I'm not going to be the same player I was, but, I can still contribute. James says we got to be healed. The inside has to be repaired for the outside to be relevant. But too many times we're limping through life because we haven't taken the time to allow God's word that was planted in our hearts to grow. This is not about doing more. James talks a lot about works and doing things for Jesus in his book. But we start with the fact that God's word has to infiltrate every ounce of who you are. And his word provides self-awareness and healing so that when we go out and do the works that God calls us to do, we're ready, we're prepared, and people are drawn to us. Not because I'm so special, but because God's word is that much and that big in our lives. And through that, through being obedient to that, we can grow, we can be healed, and we can have the impact for the world that God calls us to have. That is what James calls us to do. But we recognize who God is. And we're going to close with the song, Great Are You, Lord. It talks about God gives life. He's love. He's light in the darkness. He brings hope. This call for the inside to be repaired is not so you get your act together. It's so Jesus can heal you. He can provide the hope, the light in the darkness, and just empower you to be him in this world. Because Jesus is life-giving. He's not life-sucking. And he wants more for you.